At 04:52 a.m. on March 7, 1945, on the eastern bank of the Rhine River near the German town of Remagen, a lone American infantry platoon reported that it had crossed the Ludendorff Bridge and was holding positions on the far side. That report should not have existed. The bridge had been identified days earlier as a demolition target. German engineers had wired it with explosives. Allied intelligence assessed the likelihood of capturing any intact Rhine crossing as extremely low. The operational plan assumed that all major bridges would be destroyed before American ground forces arrived. Crossing the Rhine, according to doctrine, would require a deliberate assault supported by massive engineering effort, artillery preparation, and air support. Yet at Remagen, the bridge was still standing, and American soldiers were already across it. By dawn, the bridge was under continuous artillery fire. Explosions shook its steel frame. Sections of the roadway collapsed into the river. Smoke and dust obscured visibility. Still, men continued to cross. Wounded were evacuated back across the same span. Engineers rushed forward to reinforce a structure that had not been designed to survive combat damage of that scale. When German charges finally detonated, the bridge did not fall. In official records, the crossing is described as unexpected but opportunistic, the rapid exploitation of an unforeseen opening. What those records do not explain is how a lightly equipped infantry platoon managed to establish a foothold east of the Rhine while the bridge beneath them was actively being destroyed. From a distance, the event looks like a bold gamble that happened to succeed. From the ground, it was a sequence of decisions made under collapsing assumptions where survival depended on speed, restraint, and the willingness to act before the system had time to respond. This is not a story about a planned breakthrough. It is a story about how an outcome deemed nearly impossible became real because the moment existed briefly, and someone acted before it closed. The Ludendorff Bridge spanned the Rhine at one of its narrowest and fastest-moving points. Built during World War I, it consisted of steel trusses anchored by heavy stone towers at each end. Its design prioritized durability over flexibility. It could carry rail traffic and vehicles, but it was not intended to absorb repeated explosive damage. The eastern approach to the bridge rose sharply from the riverbank into a network of tunnels, rail yards, and steep slopes. Defenders occupying that side could fire down onto the bridge deck with minimal exposure. The western approach, where American forces advanced, offered little cover. Any movement onto the bridge was immediately visible. Weather conditions that morning were cold and damp. Fog hung low over the river, partially obscuring the far bank, but also limiting visibility for attackers. Smoke from earlier demolitions mixed with river mist, creating uneven sightlines that shifted minute by minute. German forces in the area were disorganized, but not absent. Units retreating from the West Bank attempted to regroup on the eastern side. Volkssturm elements, remnants of regular army units, and engineers tasked with demolition all operated in overlapping, poorly coordinated zones. Orders conflicted. Authority was fragmented. For American forces, the tactical picture was equally unstable. Intelligence suggested the bridge was likely destroyed or about to be. Armor and heavy engineering assets lagged behind the advancing infantry. Communications were strained by rapid movement and unexpected contact. The platoon that crossed first did so without the benefit of artillery preparation or armor support. Their primary advantage was momentum. German defenders were still reacting to the failure of the demolition charges and the speed of the American advance. The environment magnified risk. The bridge offered no lateral movement. Retreat required crossing the same exposed span under fire. Collapse was not theoretical. It was expected. Every step onto the bridge was taken with the understanding that it might be the last solid ground available. The platoon leader was First Lieutenant Karl H. Timmermann, 24 years old, an infantry officer with limited combat experience but a reputation for decisiveness. Before the war, he worked as a machinist's apprentice, accustomed to precision, timing, and the consequences of hesitation around heavy equipment. His platoon consisted largely of replacements who had joined the unit in the final months of the campaign. They were trained, but not seasoned. Their familiarity with one another was recent. Trust was functional rather than deep. Sergeant Eugene Dorland, one of the squad leaders, had grown up working construction jobs across the Midwest. He understood unstable structures and how loads shifted under stress. That intuition would matter on a bridge already damaged by explosives and shell fire. None of the men expected to cross the Rhine that morning. Their orders had emphasized reconnaissance and pressure, not assault. When the bridge appeared intact through smoke and fog, the situation outpaced briefing assumptions almost immediately. Timmermann did not pause to request permission. He assessed the span, the enemy reaction, and the narrow window before demolition could be reattempted. The decision to move was made quickly and communicated simply. The platoon moved not because the plan demanded it, but because waiting would close the only opening they were likely to see. In that moment, their prior training mattered less than their willingness to act before doctrine caught up with reality. Allied operational planning for the Rhine crossing was based on certainty. Certainty that German forces would destroy every major bridge, and certainty that American engineers would be required to force a crossing under fire. Doctrine assumed deliberate preparation, artillery softening, airstrikes, smoke cover, pontoon bridges, and coordinated assaults supported by armor. The system was designed to eliminate improvisation. Infantry units were not expected to initiate a Rhine crossing on their own. Their role was to secure riverbanks, identify crossing sites, and hold ground until the larger mechanism of the army arrived. Engineers planned the crossings. Commanders synchronized timing. Logistics ensured flow. No single platoon was meant to decide when the Rhine would be crossed. At Remagen, that system lagged behind reality. The German demolition plan had failed partially, not completely. Charges detonated unevenly. Structural damage was severe, but not catastrophic. The bridge remained standing in a state that doctrine did not account for. Damaged, unstable, but still usable. For the moment. American command structures were not positioned to respond instantly. Higher headquarters did not yet understand that the bridge was intact. Requests for guidance would have taken time to process, relay, and approve. By the time formal orders arrived, the opportunity would almost certainly be gone. The system that was supposed to work assumed predictability. It assumed that major events unfolded slowly enough for coordination to matter. At Remagen, the pace of events outran the system entirely. What remained was intent without instruction. The broader objective, crossing the Rhine, was clear. The method was not. The system had no mechanism for authorizing a platoon-level decision with strategic consequences. Lieutenant Timmermann understood that waiting for permission was functionally the same as declining the opportunity. The system could not adapt quickly enough to the conditions unfolding on the bridge deck. Doctrine did not fail. It simply had nothing to say about what to do when its core assumptions collapsed simultaneously. The decisive moment occurred as American troops reached the western end of the bridge and confirmed that it was still standing. Timmermann had seconds to decide. Option 1 was to hold position and report. This aligned with doctrine. It preserved lives in the short term and deferred responsibility upward. It also allowed German engineers time to reset charges or bring additional explosives forward. The likelihood of the bridge surviving another attempt was low. Option 2 was to move immediately. Crossing meant exposure to fire from the eastern bank, potential collapse beneath their feet, and isolation on the far side of the Rhine. Retreat, if required, would mean crossing the same span under worse conditions. Timmerman chose to cross. The decision was not framed as heroism or risk-taking. It was framed as timing. The bridge was standing now. It would not be standing later. The only way to exploit the situation was to act before the enemy or the system could react. Once the first men stepped onto the bridge, the decision became irreversible. Movement drew fire. Explosions shook the structure. Turning back would expose the platoon without reducing risk. The platoon advanced in short bounds, hugging the damaged railbed and steel framework for what cover existed. Speed mattered more than formation. Spacing mattered more than alignment. The decision did not guarantee success. It simply accepted that delay guaranteed failure. Survival on the bridge depended on minimizing time exposed rather than eliminating threat. The platoon moved in controlled bursts, stopping only when explosions or concentrated fire forced them to ground. Men avoided the center of the roadway, favoring areas where the structure appeared less damaged. They stepped over twisted metal and craters without pausing to assess stability beyond what was immediately visible. Judgment was rapid and imperfect. German defenders on the eastern bank fired sporadically. Their fields of fire were disrupted by smoke, confusion, and the unexpected speed of the crossing. The platoon exploited that hesitation, advancing whenever fire slackened rather than waiting for silence. Explosions from delayed charges and artillery impacts shook the bridge repeatedly. Each detonation threatened collapse. The platoon responded by accelerating movement rather than freezing. Standing still increased exposure without improving safety. Once across, survival required immediate adaptation. The platoon did not push outward aggressively. It established hasty positions using terrain folds, tunnel entrances, and rubble near the bridgehead. The priority was denying German forces the ability to fire directly onto the bridge. Ammunition was conserved from the outset. Fire was aimed and limited. The objective was not to defeat enemy forces east of the Rhine, but to survive long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Engineers began crossing almost immediately behind the infantry. Their presence altered the equation. What had been a temporary gamble became a race to stabilize a collapsing structure under fire. Survival during those first hours was not the result of superior firepower or planning. It was the result of movement, timing, and the willingness to accept instability rather than wait for certainty that would never arrive. The cost of the crossing became evident within hours. The platoon that secured the eastern bank did not emerge intact or rested. It emerged depleted, exposed, and operating at the edge of exhaustion. Casualties mounted quickly. Men were wounded by shrapnel from artillery rounds striking the bridge superstructure. Others were injured by falling debris or twisted metal dislodged by explosions. Medical treatment was improvised, conducted in shallow cover near tunnel entrances and embankments with limited supplies and no evacuation route that could be considered safe. Fatigue set in unevenly. Adrenaline carried the platoon through the initial crossing and establishment of positions, but once the immediate threat stabilized, exhaustion followed sharply. Many had been moving continuously for hours under fire, without food or rest. Reaction times slowed. Decision-making narrowed. Ammunition levels dropped faster than anticipated. Defensive fire had to be sustained to keep German forces from regaining direct observation of the bridge. Every round expended reduced the platoon's ability to absorb a coordinated counterattack. Automatic weapons were conserved aggressively. Rifle fire became deliberate and sparse. The terrain east of the bridge offered limited protection. Steep slopes restricted movement. Tunnels provided cover, but also confined escape routes. The platoon's perimeter remained shallow, vulnerable to artillery and infiltration. There was no depth to absorb losses. Psychological pressure intensified as German artillery adjusted. Each impact reinforced the awareness that the bridge could collapse at any moment, cutting off retreat and resupply. Men fought with the understanding that survival depended not only on holding ground, but on the structure behind them remaining intact. The platoon was still holding, but it was doing so without margin, aware that its ability to resist depended entirely on how quickly the larger system could respond. The system responded with speed once the reality at Remagen became clear. Higher headquarters redirected resources immediately. Engineers, armor, and additional infantry units were rushed toward the bridgehead. Air support intensified to suppress German artillery positions targeting the span. Traffic across the bridge increased despite damage. Engineers worked continuously to reinforce weakened sections, accepting casualties as the price of urgency. Temporary pontoon bridges were planned and constructed downstream to relieve pressure. German forces attempted repeatedly to destroy the bridge. Artillery barrages intensified. Air attacks followed. Even sabotage efforts were attempted by swimmers and frogmen. Each attempt failed narrowly, often due to timing rather than design. At the operational level, the unexpected crossing forced rapid adjustment. Plans were rewritten, timelines compressed. The Rhine, long treated as a final barrier, was suddenly behind American forces. Momentum shifted decisively. The platoon that crossed first was absorbed into a rapidly expanding bridgehead. Its role diminished as larger units took over. Losses were recorded. Actions were summarized. The extraordinary became procedural almost overnight. Doctrine would later acknowledge the event, but it would not fundamentally change. The crossing at Remagen remained an exception, a moment when reality outran planning and individuals acted before the system could respond. Today, the remains of the Ludendorff Bridge stand along the Rhine as stone towers without a span, preserved as a reminder of what once connected two banks at a decisive moment. Visitors see the ruins and learn that the bridge was captured intact, often without understanding how narrow the window truly was. What history tends to compress into a single decision was, on the ground, a sequence of risks accepted under collapsing assumptions. The platoon did not cross because it was ordered to, nor because success was assured. It crossed because waiting meant certainty of failure, and because action, however unstable, was the only remaining option. The bridge eventually fell days later, weakened beyond recovery. By then, it no longer mattered. The crossing had already reshaped the final phase of the war in Europe. If preserving grounded, carefully researched stories like this matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel to support our team and help ensure these histories continue to be told.